Now, before we move on any farther, we're going to be talking about the core piece of an Angular application, which is components. And that raises the question, what is a component? Well, it's very important that rather than looking at the code behind a component, we understand them from a conceptual level. Conceptually, a component is a combination of display and logic. Once you think of a component in that respect, then you'll start to use them appropriately in your Angular applications. Now, as we dig into the subject of components, the basic building blocks of Angular, we'll just be covering the basics here. There's a lot more in-depth techniques that would take too long to cover in this video. We have another pro-only course, The Fundamentals of Angular Directives, that's dedicated to teaching you much more than this course can on how to create maintainable components and really understand the subject and become an expert on it. So check out that course. The link is given below. Let's take a look at the website for the United States Soccer League, MLS Soccer. If we were to build this page in Angular, we would use a large set of components to display the various pieces of this page, each piece of display having corresponding functionality. For example, up at the top is a list of the icons of all the teams in the league. We might have one component that displays all of those icons and detects when we click one of the icons and knows to navigate us to the right place. We might also have another component that shows the nav bar. The things that the nav bar displays might be based on where you're at, if you're in one part of the country or another, or you're likely to speak one language or another. Next, underneath that, we've got the ad. That might be another component that talks to some ad service to figure out what image to display and how to display it. Underneath that, we have two very main stories or videos. Again, this might be two instances of the same component that's in charge of displaying these main level stories. And they get their data, the text that's showing underneath and the images from someplace else. And they know when you click on one of these two tiles to possibly change the display, render a video and start playing it, or do something else appropriate. Each of these pieces could be its own component. And again, we're talking about display and functionality. It's not just rendering the image with the text on top of it that's important. It's what functionality goes along with that piece of display. Here's a quick exercise. Open up Twitter and look at your Twitter feed and think about all the different components that might be involved if you were to break that page down into components. Think about which pieces of display would be their own separate component with display and functionality going along with them. Now let's go over to the application that we created a little while ago, our Flopbuster application. And we're going to look at the one component that's been created here, the app component. Again, notice we've got four files for the component, the CSS, the HTML, the spec, which is the test file, and the TypeScript file. The two main parts of a component are the display and the logic, and those are represented by the HTML and the TypeScript files. The test is only when we're doing unit tests, and the CSS is there just to encapsulate any CSS that we may have that's specific to that component, but that's not something we even always need. So let's start by looking at the HTML for our component. This HTML has a bunch of commented out HTML, some styles, and if we scroll way down, we finally get some actual HTML, which has some anchor tags, some SVG images. This is everything that's in that default project that Angular creates for us. But ultimately, what we have here is display. Now let's look at the TypeScript file. Here's where things start to get even more interesting. We have two main things that are going on here. We have a decorator. You'll remember from the TypeScript section we were looking at, the decorators start with the @, have a name, and then an open parentheses, and they can take parameters. In this case, this is the component decorator, and it takes in one parameter, which is an object. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The other part of the component is the class itself. In this case, it's named app component. Those two pieces work together. The component decorator decorates this component and tells Angular some very important pieces of information about the app component. For example, it tells Angular where the template for this component is. So it ties together the logic, which is this TypeScript file, with the display, which is the HTML file. Those two things are tied together by that template URL specification that's sent into the component decorator. There's the style URLs property, which is a list of CSS files that goes along with this component. Notice there can only be one template URL, but you can have multiple style files. Normally there's only one. And a lot of times we don't even need that because we don't have styles specific to a given component. And finally, we have the selector property up here on line 4. This is the string approot. You may be wondering what the selector is and why it's set to approot. That's actually fairly easy to answer by going over to our index.html file for this application and viewing that. And let's look right here on line 11. See, we have an approot HTML element. Now, if you're familiar enough with HTML, you'll know that approot is not a built-in HTML element. There's no such thing as the approot element. Instead, this is a special thing called a custom element, and browsers support that. You can have custom elements or elements that really don't exist in the HTML specification, and the browser will just ignore it. But Angular doesn't. Angular comes along, sees that approot, and it knows about the app component. It's processed our app component file and seen the selector which says approot. And therefore, when it encounters the approot element in our index.html file, it knows that that's the component that belongs in that spot in the display. Now you may also be looking at line 9, this title property, and think that that is another piece of important metadata about the component. But that's not actually true. The title property is simply a custom piece of data that's been given to this component by default when we create a starter application in Angular. We can delete this title property if we want, and that's okay. It doesn't break Angular. What's important to this being a component is what's given in the component decorator. The title property is data about the component. Thinking back to our MLSsoccer.com website, for example, this text down here on Soccer Analytics, that might be a display text property on the component that would display that area of text, similar to the way the title is here. And we'll see that in action in the next section when we talk about displaying data. So those are the pieces of a component: the decorator, the class, and then the HTML itself. In the next section, we'll begin working with components and actually using them to display the data that we want to display.